we are going to speed along because we've got two different reviews to cover. I and Rosie Mansfield are starting us off with a rapid evidence review into the impact of UK school closures on children during the COVID-19 pandemic. We look both for harms and any mitigation strategies that could address them, and the searches were conducted in May 2021. That's quite early on, and it meant that there were certainly unresolved questions. And what we're going to tell you about is both what we found, what has happened since, and Rosie is going to be concentrating on mental health. I'm going to be looking more broadly at learning disruption and its impacts on primary and secondary school pupils. What you've got on the slide are a summary of our findings, and I want to particularly underline that the impacts aren't on learning alone. There was very clear evidence of impacts on nutrition, physical health, and that was from the restricted access to the social context of the school, including the school breakfast, school lunches that children living in poverty would have otherwise have had access to, and also that the inequalities in access to outdoor space. Mental health and well-being, Rosie will cover later. We know there were some gains, some losses, and there's a good deal of uncertainty in the data at the time when we collected it. We were also aware of increased exposure to risk factors at home, both from poverty itself, but also from risk of domestic violence, safeguarding, and so on. On the whole, we found a mixed picture at the level of the individual, and still some uncertainty about what the longer term impact might be. I want to go back to the question of impact on attainment, and I want to underline there are still uncertainties here. Modelling of impacts on attainment at the start of the pandemic probably overestimated learning losses. They were some of the earliest reporting was predicting, it was doing predictive modelling of if this has been lost now, what will the impact be later? Pretty much those predictions have not come true, and OECD in a very recent summary of the research reckons that the impacts on learning losses have been easier to repair than those on mental health and well-being. Certainly regularly collected test data during the pandemic showed that yes, there were dips in attainment when schools were closed. They tended to repair when schools were reopened, and some of the documentation on what losses are really relatively modest, and that includes relatively modest evidence for the widening of disadvantage gaps, though yes, they certainly haven't closed. Twist et al. Is a recent summary from the NFER on that. At the moment, we remain in a position of uncertainty. The most recent attempt to explore a relationship between outcomes and what schools did during the pandemic or their current use of interventions has not demonstrated any relationship. We're still lacking evidence on the likely interaction between harms. And if you think back to that previous slide, we think that for schools, it's the interaction between harms that probably most forcefully presents itself. We know, for instance, that the youngest age groups were most affected from a point of view of schools thinking about children coming back into class after having been at home. And what schools were particularly concerned about are social dimensions to learning, understanding school routines, opportunities to socialise with their peers, and particularly opportunities for speaking and listening. There is little research evidence yet investigating what schools themselves did during the pandemic or how they are planning now that we're into a recovery phase. We think this is an absence of evidence that needs repair. Here are our key messages from our review for policy research and practice. Catch-up funding focused simply on learning losses ignores the breadth and complexity of pupil needs. It doesn't take into account how they might interact. A literature review I and a team at UCL ran on learning disruption due to natural disasters highlights the value of integrating planning for recovery, making sure that local knowledge is the basis upon which that planning takes place, and allowing the curriculum to be rebased and its reach broadened, not narrowed to, for instance, catch up on literacy and numeracy alone. We think that letting schools take the lead in recovery planning may be more effective than centrally prescribed interventions. It's noticeable the National Tutor Programme, where the government spent a lot of money, has not had good pickup from the school system. It doesn't answer their needs. Also, some of the interventions prescribed have been based on children falling behind under normal circumstances. These are not normal circumstances. This is a pandemic which has had very different impacts on kids. To help close attainment gaps, we think there is a real funding issue in schools themselves. Schools working with high poverty communities do not get the resources they need to support basic pupil welfare, yet that's absolutely, that schools play a key part in developing more resilient communities. That's been shown very clearly through COVID, and we would like more attention being paid to that. And the final point is that we need more research into the recovery strategies that schools develop. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and over to Rosie.
Thanks, Gemma. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So at the time that we conducted the rapid evidence review, the results relating to the impact on school, children, young people's mental health were quite mixed. One of the main studies was the coast-based study. This was led by researchers at the University of Oxford. They collected a large amount of data from families, parents and carers, as well as young people themselves from March 2020 through to July. They found that young people experienced the highest levels of mental health symptoms when the restrictions were highest, and it's provided good evidence of some of the inequalities in these experiences. But they didn't have any pre-pandemic mental health symptoms, and the sample wasn't nationally representative. In terms of national level data, the COVID-19 follow-up of the NHS Digital Prevalence Study found a higher proportion of children were experiencing mental health difficulties during the pandemic, but this study did suffer from quite large dropout during the COVID wave and different modes of data collection. But as I said, findings were mixed. So in the southwest of England, a study found improvements in mental health, so reduced anxiety and increased well-being. And this was thought to be potentially from reduced school-related stresses. So who was most negatively impacted? From the evidence found in the review, these are some of the groups that were most negatively impacted. And actually some of these groups are groups that we knew prior to the pandemic were experiencing greater mental health difficulties, for example, girls and LGBTQ+ young people. So although these aren't surprising, it does indicate that the pandemic has widened existing inequalities in the experiences of mental health difficulties. One of the things the review found in the early stages was that there were common methodological limitations. So many studies lacked pre-pandemic comparisons of symptoms, so we couldn't really look at change in mental health. Many were cross-sectional and they were convenient samples, so they weren't based on the population. There was also a difference in terms of whether the young people were asked themselves or whether parents and carers or teachers were asked to report mental health and wellbeing. And we know there can be quite big differences in how these things are reported. And if we think about parents reporting behavioural difficulties at a time where they're trying to work from home and they have children at home, I think those behaviour difficulties will be reported quite differently to if the young people were asked themselves. And we have seen this in the research. One of the major things with this population is that it's very difficult to separate developmental changes in mental health to what that would have taken place anyway to those due to the pandemic. So we've seen secular trends, increases in mental health difficulties in this population anyway. And we also know that throughout adolescence, we see an increase in, for example, anxiety and depression. And so it's been challenging unpicking these increases that are due to the pandemic and those that would have occurred anyway. As Gemma said, there was very limited evidence base at the time of the review for how these mental health impacts were being mitigated. The immediate responses that we recommended at the time were to help schools find ways to monitor and support students' mental health as they returned. We directed to evidence-based resources from the Anna Freud National Centre for Children and Families. They have a full suite of measures to evaluate mental health and wellbeing in the school population. But in the longer term, we proposed that better quality evidence was needed, both on the impact of the pandemic and on school strategies for mitigating. We also recommended structural solutions to reduce inequalities, given that we could see inequalities in mental health experiences, and a properly resourced public health approach that builds capacity both within schools and between sectors. So since the review, there's been a huge body of literature, and we actually saw on the living map that mental health and wellbeing had some of the most studies that have been published, but the evidence is still quite mixed. So very recently, there was a large descriptive paper of 17,000 UK school students that found positive impacts of the pandemic on wellbeing. But there's starting to be more of a focus on longitudinal research as a kind of better standard for evidence. So there's been more regional studies that have been published. So Wright and colleagues here published work from the Wirral Child Development Study. They found that mental health difficulties in young adolescents had worsened during the pandemic compared to pre-pandemic scores. But again, there's some issues of representativeness, as this study had a slightly higher rate of high-risk families. Beyond our review, there's been some more recent updates. So Viner and colleagues updated a review on school closures and impacts to wellbeing. They overall concluded that there have been negative impacts. Similarly, Eric Robinson and colleagues have concluded that in longitudinal cohort studies, although not just focused on young people, mental health has worsened. And more longitudinal work is being published from the UK population cohorts as well that indicates that mental health has been negatively impacted, and particularly in this younger age group. In January, we also did see some advancements in knowledge on mitigations. The Department for Education published this report on school recovery strategies. And what was clear is that schools felt that actually wellbeing was a greater priority than lost learning, and that this should be prioritised before any kind of catch-up, academic catch-up could be properly effective. And so schools were reporting prioritising mental health and wellbeing interventions in the year 2021 to 22. And they were calling for further support for funding for social care and welfare services to address impacts of widening inequalities in education and mental health. They were also saying that they were trying to identify higher priority students living in poverty, students with special educational needs, and students that are in school years for examinations and transition years. And in terms of what they were actually delivering, they were prioritising kind of a broad curriculum with art and sports for wellbeing, providing more information on mental health to parents and to pupils, and investing in additional staff training around mental health. So in terms of upcoming evidence, the Education for Wellbeing programme is a Department for Education funded programme that consists of 2 national level cluster randomised control trials, evaluating a range of school-based mental health interventions across England, both in primary and secondary schools. And almost 400 schools will be involved in the evaluation of these interventions. So these trials collect longitudinal data from young people in terms of their mental health and wellbeing. So that will be tens of thousands of young people across England. But what's also important is they conduct in-depth implementation evaluations of the interventions to see what actually works in schools and what is feasible within the English school context. So there's a lot of qualitative work being done as well with school staff that can highlight some of the barriers. Are you trying to stop me?
Last bit, Rosie.
Okay, upcoming evidence on COVID that overcomes some of the methodological limitations comes from the Education for Wellbeing programme. It's some of the best causal evidence because we have a pre-pandemic scores and a comparable control condition. So please look out for the DFE report at the end of the month and the full findings in the Royal Society for Open Science. In terms of what's next, a lot of it's been covered in other talks, but we need to think about structural solutions to build back fairer. We need to invest in not only school sector, but in CAMS and increase the connections between sectors. We need to improve evidence base about what works in schools for implementing mental health and wellbeing interventions, and invest a significant amount of resources to build a comprehensive public health approach that builds capacity between and within sectors. Sorry, I've gone over time.
No, I think you're just about spot on, Rosie. So thank you very much indeed. And I forgot to switch my camera off, which is the main reason I was introducing this session and not Rachel. So never mind. This is an opportunity for people in the audience to ask some questions. I think one of the issues that comes up for me listening to Rosie go through the latest evidence around mental health, and there has been more certain knowledge coming through, updated studies on that particular issue, but both she and I in a way are underlining that what we see is a need for investment in education. I thought Marvin's closing comments in the previous session were spoke very powerfully to education. For me, COVID has been a wake-up call for a need to invest, and I wonder what other people in the conversation think. So any questions anybody wants to raise? I have not probably been keeping a sufficient eye on the chat, but I'm going to say if there's not a direct question to either me or Rosie, what I'm going to do is pass on to Melissa and Nina, because I think they will complement the presentation. We were looking at UK evidence only, and I forgot to say that at the beginning, but they've been looking more broadly and may have other things back. I'm not going to answer the question on clarifying education, I'm afraid. Let's see where we get to with Melissa and Nina. Okay, over to you two.
Thank you so much. That was a really fascinating look at some of the work you've been doing. And I do see a lot of parallels between the work that we've done. So I'll just share my screen, and hopefully we can, you can see that perfectly well, hopefully. Excellent. So my name is Dr. Melissa Bond, and I have to apologise for my seemingly sunny appearance. It's because I'm in Australia now, since we did this work together. And so myself, along with my colleague Nina Bergdahl here, who will be presenting with me today. And as Gemma's already said, Dylan Kneale was going to be presenting with us, but he's double booked, and so he won't be with us today. But we do represent our larger team. And we did undertake a systematic review that looked more globally at the evidence that was happening and being undertaken, looking at emergency remote education in secondary schools during the pandemic. And so we did only focus our particular systematic review on secondary education. I think that's really important to mention. Okay. So we also conducted our search in May of 2021, and our systematic review included 81 studies. And so the focus that we're going to touch on today is about what the current state of research was at the close of the review, what we know now, having done the review, about how to move education online effectively, and what this means for policy research and practice for the future. So our review included, as I said, 81 studies from around the world. We found a lot of most of the research had actually come from Asia, but also Europe and then North America. And I actually we found it really interesting because in a way it actually also followed the trajectory of the pandemic as it moved throughout the world. We did have just over half of the studies were from high income countries, but we did also have a reasonable amount of studies from lower, middle and low income countries as well. In terms of the characteristics of the research that we found, and this is where it is already echoing what we've just heard today, is that the research that was being undertaken is what I've termed emergency remote research. So it wasn't necessarily, it was a lot of this cross-sectional research. It was this convenience sampling in terms of the students and the respondents that people were able to get in touch with and involved in the research, rather than perhaps a more considered and more longitudinal studies. We found that a lot of the research focused on student and teacher data. However, there was a minimal focus on students with special educational needs and disabilities. And there's also a question with our research on whose voices are really being heard in the research that was being undertaken, and in which ways were those voices being represented in the research that came out. And we actually found that we had very limited research that was actually involving parents, which I think is slightly in contrast to what we just heard. But we found that quite fascinating, really, given the experiences and the influence that parents have in education. In terms of the most frequently used types of technology, we found that synchronous collaboration tools, so things like video conferencing, was certainly used the most, followed closely by knowledge organisation sharing and text-based tools. And even we found it interesting that even during pandemic times, STEM subjects were still the most researched. And that years 10 and 11 within the secondary year levels were the most focused on. In terms of engagement, what we actually found in this research was that some students, as Jeff mentioned, some pockets of students were actually more motivated to learn and complete their schoolwork. And that some of these students were perhaps people who had been more reticent in the past, perhaps more reserved, and found this way of learning online that they were able to interact a little bit more and participate more in their lessons. That it also gave some students a heightened sense of responsibility. Others found group work a little bit easier to do when collaborating online rather than in a face-to-face setting. And so the top 5 indicators of enjoyment that we found included that heightened self-regulation, a little bit of increased understanding of topics, positive study habits, enjoyment, and a sense of well-being. With that said, we also found really heightened sense of social disengagement, with just over a quarter of studies, saying that students were feeling particularly isolated socially, that they were feeling not just that physical distance from their classmates, from their peers, and from their teachers, but also that emotional distance from them as well. We actually found more instances or examples of behavioural disengagement in studies from higher income countries as opposed to those from lower middle income countries. But this could also be due to the increased use of synchronous tools like video conferencing, which was more prevalent in higher income countries rather than lower income countries, because they were more focused on or more able to use text-based tools rather than synchronous collaboration tools. But we also found that it was not just that having to learn new tools that was an issue. It was having to learn how to learn online that was also really overwhelming, alongside the life load that people were having to deal with outside of learning as well. We found that that was the case for not just students, but also for teachers. In terms of parent engagement, there was a mixed bag in terms of what we found. So we found that WhatsApp was a very popular tool, especially in lower middle income countries, but that not all families, of course, had enough devices in the household, or they didn't have the setup all ready to go, or perhaps they didn't have the technological or the content knowledge to be able to support their children, even if they wanted to be able to support them. And that students really particularly needed help when it came to creating visual materials for their classes. And we also found that in some cases there was an increased demand on girls at home, and that was particularly the case in some of the more low income and lower middle income countries as well. There were also cases of increased parent engagement where, you know, suddenly the learning was more visible to parents at home in some cases, where parents were then being able to be more involved in their child's learning because they were, you know, it was more evident. As we know, in secondary education, as students get older, we find that it is less visible for parents in terms of what students are learning and the skills and the knowledge that they're accruing. And so for some families, this was actually an opportunity to get a little bit more idea of what was happening in their learning. So how do we move education online effectively? What did we learn from this review in terms of what we might be able to employ now, that even though we're still in the throes of this pandemic, but also, you know, in the future, ongoing? We found that synchronous collaboration tools were particularly important, especially for social engagement, especially for maintaining that level of presence. And so, for example, in studies that used Zoom and had made time for social time, so say, for example, 5 minutes at the beginning of a class and 5 minutes at the end, for students just to be able to catch up and have that opportunity to have, you know, almost regular everyday types of conversations, was actually found to be really engaging. And also to provide lots of opportunities for that collaborative group work to encourage social engagement. And to that end, you know, making sure that you're using learning management systems that have collaborative tools enabled, but also to use quizzes as well, embedded either within LMS or within videos, to just have that ongoing sort of even formative checking of where students are at with their knowledge and where they might need help. In terms of multimedia production tools, they were also found to be quite engaging. So, but we did find that videos that were made both by the teachers themselves, so that they appear in the videos, or at least their voices in the video, being combined alongside other resources like YouTube, like OAK lessons, were more engaging than just using resources like YouTube, for example. And the opportunities to record and use things like oral assessments, conversations, debates, role plays, those kinds of, you know, continuing things like music and drama performances through the use of technology was found to be really engaging for students. In terms of approaches, you know, ensuring that scaffolding is happening for students with clear expectations and including time for synchronous and asynchronous activities. I've already said allowing that collaboration to happen, but ensuring that students know how to collaborate with their peers effectively, like what that looks like, ensuring that they have that kind of guidance. And finally, in terms of assessment, you know, using things like self and peer assessment to enable ongoing formative assessment, but also to perhaps, you know, with quizzes, lessening the load on teachers, and also ensuring that there's some differentiation there for students. Nina.
Yes, thank you. And I think that's very important also to highlight that even though we found those 21 different strategies of assessment, there was also this issue of many teachers reporting that they were unsecure of how to assess in the new online setting. We're going to look at the implications for policy practice and research, and starting with the policy, it relates just to that, to teachers' digital skills, knowledge and pedagogical approaches. And we found that teachers who had a high level of tech knowledge and skills before the pandemic seemed to embrace this online learning and switch to online learning more seamlessly and could facilitate effective learning, collaboration and assessment. So even though we found these instances, these were not the report of the majority of the teachers. So there were examples, yes, but that was not the overall experience. When we look into further opportunities for teachers' professional development in the area of blended, hybrid and online learning, then schools must include effective strategies to make learning more inclusive for all students. And we know that co-located face-to-face learning is not a learning that fits all students as it is today, which can be an answer to the reduced social stress that some students report when learning on a distance instead. It can be kind of an explanation to why they prefer distance learning, and what we've seen also with increased demands on distance education after the switch back to the co-located classroom. So that means that schools should consider socio-digital infrastructure and high quality digital tools and resources, and teachers and students' readiness for them to remain relevant in the future, because digitalization is continuously progressing. It's not linked to a pandemic. It's taken a leap during the pandemic, but it will continue even after the pandemic. And this also relates to teacher education, to acknowledge these changes that has happened and will continue to happen, and that the teachers need to be prepared to teach for at least 10 to 20 years to come. So what are the emerging practices and educational formats that we will see? The results also reveal that teachers reported that shifting to the new format was a struggle, and it was not only to learn how to communicate the non-verbal signals and redesigning the classes, but to create this digital content, which was primarily physical in the other room. So there is a big need to allow time for teachers to have that possibility. Otherwise, it could potentially lead to monotonous teaching, reduced interaction, and simply poor learning designs. So to be able to provide high quality teaching is related to both support and professional development, but also allowing the time. There needs to be an increased recognition of the ongoing issues related to the digital divide. And that relates both to, as we said, with the gender issue, where, for example, girls in lower middle income countries, such as Ecuador and Zimbabwe, could have household chores or face issues of abuse and distraction, like we heard previously. But later research also addresses the ethical issues of now being admitted to the students or learners' private home, and how that affects the students' sense of identity when they are in school and when they have to disclose how they are actually living. So then there also needs to be a heightened consideration of the wider school community, and that relates to both how schools communicate with parents or groups of parents using digital technologies, and also to find solutions for students to engage in a school learning community or the local community, to get this sense of connectivity that is possible using digital technologies, as we have seen examples demonstrate, but it's not widely adopted. We found also that the research could have perhaps been more thoroughly linked to theory, and especially engagement theory, which we had a lens on, but there is also an opening for researchers to explore how to contribute to crisis education using the wide range of research that currently exists and is still published. So as Rosie said, we don't yet know the long-term consequences of engagement in learning, in online learning. For example, Lancet published a study that said that the more practice you have, the better the quality of the learning from the teacher's perspective and experience from the student. But this is a time of unrest, and those differ from ordinary times, which are not during unrest. However,
we've got 2 minutes left, Nina, sorry.
Yeah, so go on to the next slide, please. So as Martin Rees said, it's too early to talk about the post-pandemic, and we are still seeing a lot of research coming out that's being published relating to the shift into online learning. But there is also a talk in research about reinventing education as a response to the pandemic. So there is a clear signal that there is a before and after, so that the emergency remote teaching had a substantial impact. So we are already in the process of shifting from modernity to post-modernity, but the rapid advances have spurred this adaptation. And in a post-pandemic world, many have come to see the benefits of using digital resources and online learning when it's not a pandemic, and point out that there is quality in online learning that can represent a valid alternative to face-to-face learning. And such initiatives talk about using the best of both traditional and online instruction to break the physical boundaries of the classroom and address new requirements for teacher education, acknowledge and legitimize hybrid formats of education, and even think about contingency plans that calls for the current situation of the world with increasing unrest from different perspectives, not only the climate change, but also perhaps the situation in Ukraine, where some students are continuing to participate with their classes using distance education. So yes, I will leave it there. We can move to the next slide here, and the full report link has already been pasted, but Melissa, you will post the link to the openly accessible database where the audience and the participants can find the articles and also see, using different kinds of interaction possibilities, how they play out for different subjects and populations. And Melissa, you will also post a link to a post reflection that we published in the conversation about reasons to be hopeful after the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have until 12:25 in the breakout group, and then we will rejoin the main discussion. If people have particular questions that they would like to ask Melissa and Nina right now on their presentation, I would suggest signaling, putting a hand up, or alternatively posting something into chat. I did see a question asking about the legacy from the use of technology during the pandemic for schools. Nina, I'm aware you were in Sweden. I don't know about Sweden. I do know about Norway. In Norway, every family is well digitally connected. In England, we have a lot of digital poverty. We have lots of families, lots of areas where technology simply is not accessible. Put those two together, either comment some more on the legacy or say something about the infrastructure.
Well, I can say something about the digital infrastructure, and that is, I think it's becoming something increasingly important to, in an early phase, to remove hindrances and not increase the digital divide. And also in Sweden, we also have digital inequality when it comes to, for example, adult education, which are not allowed one-to-one solution. So they will attend using their mobile phones, but we did not do research including adult education. But I can say that in Sweden, they also used WhatsApp during the pandemic because everyone had a mobile device. However, the identification of the needs for the students needs to be done early on to prevent the lack of internet connection and to lend devices to those in need early on. But the schools here, yes, everyone has a one-to-one device offered by school.
I saw in the earlier chat, in the earlier discussion group, that the Scottish Borders gave an iPad to every child and made them internet accessible. Other research I've conducted at UCL, we do know that some families had simply got one mobile phone during the pandemic and were having to share it at home. Any other questions specifically on technology, or I'm going to open this up for wider questions? Okay, Thomas Brayford has just put into the chat that he's worried a lot of the well-being and mental health measures are short-term, and he gets the impression that the Department of Education in England thinks it's all over, whereas really it's not. Rosie, do you want to comment on the short, long-term perspectives in what you've been looking at?
Yeah, I mean, it takes investment in longitudinal research to keep following up large groups of young people to monitor this. I agree that, you know, most of the research has been cross-sectional in the earlier stages of the pandemic. So yeah, I do think we're going to be lacking ongoing monitoring of mental health and wellbeing. And it's necessary. There's a few large-scale studies, Education for Wellbeing, that I quickly said at the end is one that is going to be ongoing for the next few years, and we'll collect data from it'll be tens of thousands of young people across England. But yes, there needs to be more. For example, the NHS digital prevalence study that was conducted in 2017 and then again during COVID, we need that to be repeated, and we need to make sure that we don't see large dropouts again like we did with COVID. So I agree that there's potential for there to be a lack of ongoing mental health data.
And there's another comment just turned up again from Sue Roffey, saying that the focus appears to be on addressing individual mental health needs rather than thinking more systematically about what needs to happen across the school sector. I have certainly heard an economist argue that catch-up is entirely the wrong word to use about government's reaction to COVID, because it turns your investment strategy into doing something in the short term. We will do this rapidly, then we'll catch up, then we don't have to think about it any longer, and it actually restricts funding at a point where we need longer term investment. So that's part of my comment on that. I think one of my other comments on what Rosie has just said is I think the pandemic has really raised the issue of when and under what conditions has research got something to say, because research's timelines are very different. And actually what we saw during the pandemic was school teachers reacting very fast to problems that were turning up on their doorstep for which there weren't reliable research-based answers. Tricia Greenhalgh has written about this in Health, and I've done a conversation post on what all of this tells us about the necessary relationships between research, education and policy right now. Somebody's commented on, that's Melissa's commenting on South Australia. She might want to say it. It's in the chat line. Anybody else want to put up a hand and raise a different question? We've got about 5 minutes. We've all done incredibly well, actually.
I very much agree with Sue. I just thought I'd say that in general, it's often an afterthought. It's after someone has experienced mental health difficulties, then we think about how we identify them and then how we support them. And yes, there does need to be a lot more of a focus in promotion of mental health amongst school children and young people, and the prevention of them getting to the point where they're experiencing mental health difficulties. We had a mental health crisis before the pandemic. There was increasing rates of mental health difficulties prior to the pandemic. So we can't just make it all about that. There's lots of other things that we need to be focusing on.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, equally, poverty has got very much revealed. Its impacts on children was very much revealed during COVID. But what schools do for children living in poverty, they did it before COVID happened. They will do it after COVID has finally gone away. So there are some more deep-seated problems that need thinking about. Bev has raised what will happen if exams don't go ahead? Anybody want to pick that one up?
Well, I think that we saw in the review that there was a lot of teachers who prioritized well-being instead of cognitively challenging school tasks and assessment. And there were even countries banning assessment altogether. So, and what we heard in the previous talks was that it's easier to repair the grades than social well-being. So I think it's a good priority to invest in the well-being of students in times of crisis and unrest. and not focus so much on the assessment.
I think I would agree with Nina, and actually there normally are other ways of handling transition. Why we in England make the GCSE such a crucial transition point is a good question that might also be for longer term thinking about. Paul Fagan has just raised the issue, what will happen if COVID comes back next winter? And up above there was something also on trainee teachers having to catch up on their professional development. What I'm hearing is us underlining that we really aren't out of the woods right now, and that part of dealing with the crisis is to build teacher resilience so that they have the time, the space, the energy, to flexibly respond to what is going on in schools. And certainly from my point of view, a lot of the policy advice in England has been out of sync with what's been going on in schools, under-informed by what's been going on in schools, and perhaps over-distracted by media coverage, which has tended to highlight disaster scenarios and not necessarily helped the profession itself deal with the immediate questions that's in front of them. Have I missed anything in the chat that somebody else has noticed and wants to pick up on? Please go for it, panel.
I can say that to the question, what will happen if there's a new pandemic? We have seen a lot of initiatives. The EU Horizon project from 2020 looks to advance knowledge in response to COVID pandemics. In Latvia, there's a psycho-emotional support measures for teachers. In the Czech Republic, there's a CYPO project to support professional development. We have Poland with the remote school program and the Scottish Attainment Challenge Equity Audit. In Portugal, there's a psychology support line. So there's all kinds of initiatives going on, and those of course can be developed into bridging the gap between what's happening in the school practices and what is needed in the community.
Thank you very much. And Bev has raised another question about, okay, kids can maybe transition, young people can transition, but will they be at a disadvantage when they get to university? I have to say, I think this is a good moment for reinstating a basic principle in teaching, that teaching is a responsive art. You start from where kids are. It's not a finite delivery system in which you try and get through X amount of content, and if the time's gone, you can't do it. There are ways of taking students who may have missed out on a particular aspect of maths, let's say, but actually a good teacher will be able to repair. I think, again, it's being able to flex how we think about curriculum to take account of the fact that students may not have covered X. How can we get round? How can we rebuild that kind of competence? So I think if what we've seen from teachers is a good deal of agency, flexibility, resilience through much of COVID. What we need to do as an education system is encourage that and reward it. And on that basis, I think kids won't be disadvantaged on the longer term. Learning disruption literature certainly suggests that. All right, that's built around natural disasters. Hurricane Katrina kicked a whole hole out of the education system in the southern states. For a whole series of reasons, communities got dispersed, didn't go back to their original schools. In the longer term, it is possible to repair that if you invest and acknowledge what's gone on. Okay, we are just about out of time, guys. We are going to get moved very shortly. We've got 5 minutes in which to relax and do something else before the next session starts on IPPO cities